What about, though, as a young person, you listen to Richard, you talk about we're going to crash on the rocks. Do you have hope for Britain or England in general? Or is there like a... Because I have very little hope, and I used to have more hope as a young person, but that's because the culture war wasn't so prominent and hadn't taken over, and we just weren't thinking about it. In the 90s, things were basically going well. But do you, growing up in this time of divided culture wars and so on, it must be very weird. Do you have despair about the future of the country, or are you just a young, optimistic person because you're young and things seem possible?
No, I'm extremely pessimistic. I've seen people on Snapchat and stuff who are my own age, selling their bodies for money. That's normal. So like online prostitution and for my age is normal. Not tolerating people who have a different opinion is normal. Calling people fascist and racist 24/7, hating your country constantly, calling everyone racist. Not being skeptical of big multinational corporations, even though you say you're left wing, not believing in body autonomy, not believing in human rights, all of this stuff that I've experienced myself, I have absolute pessimism for the future. I got very little hope. I guess the hope I have is that eventually the tides will turn, and in some respects the UK will go back to some form of traditionalism, and I think we can learn a lot from older people, and that's one thing I've done myself. Like when I grew up, I thought my gran was a bit of a, she fought some out there views, but now I listen to her and I agree with her on, 92%.
Gran was right.
Yeah, and I actually interviewed her for my podcast, and it was a crazy episode because we had this woman, 86. She was with my granddad for 84 years plus, and the wisdom that she espoused of simply things like she spoke to her granddad for. Her husband for 5 years before they did anything, and the culture, the community and everything. And I think as a society we can learn so much from older people. And yeah, overall I got a terrible pessimistic view of the future, to say the least.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's sad to hear. I mean, that is sad to hear, but it sounds like it's the result of you growing up amongst people who have suffered from whatever you want to call it, the woke indoctrination, whatever phrase you want to use. They've bought into it all. They hate the country. They're intolerant of free speech. And you're the result of that generation. It must be horrendous to be having to grow up amongst these idiots, brainwashed NPCs, as you say. But like you say, it could turn back. I mean, I'm starting to think more and more. I haven't fleshed this out yet, but I tended to think, okay, things are just getting worse and worse and worse, and entropy and degeneracy. But then I look at it and go, there's only so far you can go. And you can look at the example of Weimar, and then it went back a bit aggressively towards Hitler. But you can look at history, and there's only so far humans can really go towards degeneracy. You look at Sam Smith and stuff, you go like, okay, yeah, these are all the same old trope. We're trying to be as degenerate as possible. But actually, I've started to think we will come back just because there's nowhere else to go. Steve Bannon believes in this fourth turning, and people find it a bit kooky. It's this idea there's these four different stages in history, and they just keep repeating. And he sort of believes in that a bit too much to a sort of weird degree, where apparently there was Trump was questioning whether to bomb Syria or something, and anyway, and Bannon was talking to Jared Kushner about it. I'm not remembering the story perfectly, but one thing was said was like, well, should we really do this? And Bannon sort of said, well, there's going to be loads of this kind of thing. Things have got to get darker before they get better. So he had a kind of accelerationist attitude, which at that level of the White House, people found was a bit like worrying. Wow. This was listened to a podcast with his biographer. It's like, hang on, Bannon so believes in this fourth turning that he's like, yeah, well, let things get a bit worse because then the good parts come around. But it might come round though, Rory. I basically agree with you. I wrote an article called "England is Lost Forever," but now I'm starting to think maybe it'll come round because there's nowhere else for it to go. But maybe I'm just being a deluded optimist, which is very unlike me. But confronted with your even more pessimist attitude, I've suddenly gone optimist just for balance.